Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Speaker Series. This is our first meeting of spring 2021 semester, and we're thrilled to have you here at the speaker series jointly presented by IU's Integrated Program on the Environment and the Environmental Resilience Institute. I'm Janet McCabe. I'm director of the Environmental Resilience Institute. I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today. Both IPE and ERI are founded on the understanding that interdisciplinary learning and research are absolutely essential to teach today's scholars and to solve today's problems, not to mention tomorrow's. The natural and social sciences, the humanities, and the arts are all critical and in play as we tackle climate change and the environmental challenges that are affecting our health, our communities, and our economy here in Bloomington, in Indianapolis, and around the world. IPE was founded in 2012 by the provost and the leadership of the O'Neill School, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Public Health to bring together all of the environmental and sustainability scholarship across the various schools and departments on the Bloomington campus and provide a way for students to have a truly integrative learning approach, students who are interested in environmental policy, environmental management, and all the issues that go into those types of careers. ERI was founded in 2017 as part of the IU Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. And our mission is to enhance resilience to environmental change in Indiana and beyond by accurately predicting impacts, effectively partnering with communities to implement feasible, equitable, and research-informed solutions. IPE and the ERI faculty, staff, and students have worked together to bring us a full semester worth of speakers. I want to thank Sarah Mincy and Lingqi Chenyang for helping, leading, really pulling this together. Over the course of the semester, our speakers will address a wide variety of topics ranging from resilient agriculture in the face of climate change to advocacy in energy transition, to the development of an anti-racist science of ecology, and more interesting topics. Importantly, while we meet bi-weekly for this series on Fridays at noon, the next installment will be an exception. It will be on February 4th at 11 a.m. That's a Thursday, in coordination with the O'Neill School's Environmental Policy Seminar with Dr. Shalonda Baker on the topic of energy transition. So please mark your calendars for that talk and for upcoming talks. You'll be able to find information about each talk on the ERI and IPE web pages and in our regular newsletters and upcoming events notices that our organizations send out on a regular basis, but not so frequent that it gets annoying. So here's the information for ERI. We'd love to have you join us. And here's the information for IPE. We would love to have you join that as well. If you have ideas for people we should consider for a future talk, please tell us that too. And as you'll see from our upcoming roster, we have folks from inside the IU schools and family, and we have outside speakers as well. So a few logistics on how you can engage with our speaker today. I've heard Phil speak. He's very engaging, but he wants questions. He wants to be challenged if you're so moved and tested on his ideas. That's what makes life interesting. You can put questions in the chat as you think of them, and we will monitor them as we go along. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, and then I'm saying this to remind myself as much as to let you know, we'll save a couple minutes at the end for Phil to wrap up with some concluding comments and inspiration. So now I am going to introduce our speaker. I am not going to read to you that small print that's on there. I'm sure you can probably make that out yourself. I want to hit a couple of highlights about Phil's background that I think are interesting. First of all, he is a product of Indiana. He grew up in Elwood, Indiana, which is a pretty small town northeast of Indianapolis. I have actually been there more than once. It's a lovely town. Grew up there. He taught at Ball State University. He was elected to Congress in 1975 with the Watergate class, as he refers to it, served 10 terms in Congress. And he may talk about this today, but it was a very different time to be in Congress, and it just operated very differently. And we should know about that history, because if we don't know about our history, we can't imagine things other than the way things are today. He spent time at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Part of that time was a director of the Institute of Politics. He has worked for many years with the Resources for the Future, really tremendous Washington think tank that focuses on environmental, energy, and natural resources issues. He was the director of Resources for the Future, has been on many other boards and commissions, has spoken many, many times. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn the program over to former Congressman Phil Sharp. Thank you for joining us today, Phil. And so you need to unmute yourself, Phil.
A lot of my constituency would have liked that feature to mute some of us in politics. I'm just delighted to be with you, and I appreciate you using a picture that actually helps keep me younger than is the reality. But I wanted to say how impressed I am with what's going on at Indiana University. I've only become more recently reconnected, and I must say, working on climate issues especially is extremely important, in the fact that your institute reaches out to communities and the state government. These are entities that are going to have major roles to play on this issue as we go forward. And I particularly want to congratulate Janet, as I hope people know now. She has been nominated by the new president to be the #2 person at the Environmental Protection Agency. She comes with enormous experience from the agency about the issues. But I wanted to highlight something that she has a lot of, and a lot of the new appointees have, and that is she has worked with so many different groups so that she's familiar with the enormous regional regional differences in this country, and with the breadth of stakeholders that are going to be involved in this issue, from the oil and the gas industry on one side to the advocates of environmental justice on the other. It is just amazing what she has done in this regard. Let me also say that today what I'm going to focus on is obviously the challenge of climate change policy, but my focus is going to be on cutting emissions, which we're going to be at for quite some time in this country, and not on so much on the critical issues of adapting, because the world is warming and it's having impacts, and we're going to simply be dealing with that for the entire source of our lives. Now, my approach is going to be a flyover at 50,000 feet level, and therefore some clearly general. We might get to specifics depending on your questions. And I know many of you are actually doing deep dives, real mining of these issues, and that's critical hard work, which frankly, I'm not very competent to undertake. The key points I want to make are just very broad things of what's been happening in this country over the last 4 years that portend for the likelihood that we're going to see very strong climate action over in the next coming years. And then what's happening now, because so much is happening now with the Biden administration and their approach to Congress. And then I want to spend just a little time on, given the fact that this is a long distance run, given the fact that it's very runs deep in our society, how can we think about it without getting totally depressed or intellectually overwhelmed? So let me just start with the first there. And that is this issue that despite Trump's hostility to the issue and to any policies that were in place at the federal level on climate change, the fact is we had major developments, very positive developments going on throughout the country. And I just want to quickly touch on a few. You always want to start with science. Clearly, our scientists and around the world have been documenting what's been happening, what is happening in the atmosphere and in the water and everywhere else. And what's more significant politically, perhaps, is the fact that those of us that are non-scientists are suddenly being able to see in virtually every region of America some of the impacts that are already starting to show up, and they're not very friendly and they seem to be very costly. And in addition to that, something that many of you may be involved in, we've had considerable social science along with the natural sciences, analysis, reports on policy, on ways to do this, on ways to communicate. So there is a flood of information. It's so much today compared to about 10 years ago that no one person could read it all. Well, let me look secondly to the fact that our state governments and some cities have been acting over the last 4 years very significantly. And indeed, a number of red states, which appeared to be repealing some of the not particularly dramatic policies, but they had clean energy policies in place, actually kept them and did not follow Trump on this. And indeed, other states, of course, have more aggressively, especially California, New York, even the state of Virginia, have been very active. If we turn to the economy and the marketplace, and in a sense, the hard goods of our society, it's very clear that there have been dramatic changes there as well. We all know that the costs of solar and wind have come down. They're now among the biggest new generations of power in the country. We know that the coal has dropped in 5 years, just plummeted in the electric sector, what it does. We know that there are all kinds of new businesses and new big investments in everything from electric cars to battery storage, all kinds of things. And we almost hear daily announcement from businesses and from the banking and investment community on policies and strategies that are favorable to climate. If we turn to the international market, what we discover is that in fact, those markets have an element of them that are very oriented to the clean energy and efficiency and these kind of technologies, and where we sail, and those are influencing how American manufacturers of automobiles and other things are influenced to move forward in a progressive way. We also see that policies of these foreign governments are having a big impact on these markets and on us. The fact that we have this huge decline in solar costs is very much related to policies that were adopted in Germany, in Spain, and then massive investments in China on a whole new solar industry that has cut the costs, somewhat competitive to some of our elements, but anyway, it's had a very positive impact in that way. And China and Europe and others have come out with commitments to how they plan to shift to electrifying their transportation, their automobiles, and everything else. So our producers are going to do that even if the US government fails to do that, although I think our government's going to continue acting on that. And as you may know, China has actually indicated they're committing to build a whole new industry of green heating and cooling systems for all the buildings that have to be refitted in America and elsewhere. Well, also one of the more interesting developments is really over the last 2 years is how many people and organizations have stepped forward, are making huge public pledges that and some of them are deep cuts in their carbon footprints in the products, the footprint of the products. These differ and everywhere, but state governments are doing it, city governments are doing it, universities are doing it, and very significantly, major corporations in almost every sector are doing that, including even oil and gas sector. Now, they're not all alike, and we certainly can't count on these pledges to be met, but they do have a positive impact, very much so, on our politics. They signal to the markets, they signal to innovators, they signal to investors, they signal to employees and consumers that we're headed in a new direction. It builds public support and political support for action. And any number of these corporate pledges have come with a statement, we need government policy to help us achieve this. And of course, it's changing the competitive nature of this issue. Frankly, for about 15 years on the issue, competition in the economy almost became a negative on trying to get anything accomplished because it was always viewed if you step forward, you'll get hurt economically. That is beginning to reverse itself. This is a very powerful move. So we have a spreading consensus in this country that we are underway on transforming this economy to a low carbon status. Well, now, if we turn to the second thing that I wanted to focus on, which is the what's happening now with Biden, and it is happening literally right now, just to recognize, which many of you probably know, first of all, this presidential campaign is the first ever in which the climate issue was one of the top issues that the candidate and the party were driving for. People kind of forget that in 2008, both political parties in their platforms and both candidates, McCain and Obama, committed themselves to take strong action on climate change. But frankly, there was not a lot of discussion of it during the campaigns. Now, I think people probably recognize that they laid out a number of broad general things they were planning to do, sort of the key goals, which are is tough to meet, is that by 2050, we would have a net zero carbon economy. And in the electric sector, we would even drive quicker to that and try to get there by 2035. So let's look at them governing, which we saw them seize control of the reins of the executive branch just 2 days ago, I guess it was. And by the way, I'm here in Washington where they're just now taking down all the fences and the flags and everything else, but it's a glorious sight. But they were ready to go. In fact, I would argue probably on multiple fronts issues, this administration was more ready to go because of the experience of the people, because of the transition team that they put in than we probably have seen in recent history. Clearly, their appointments represent a very strong commitment to climate change, whether it's John Kerry on the international front, Gina McCarthy at the White House, or Janet McCabe at the Environmental Protection Agency. But it's across the board. I mean, the Secretary of Treasury as well. And they have plans and issues because people have been preparing for this, especially to counter the effects of the rollback of policy that we saw over the last 4 years. And so we saw day one, the very famous moves on some of the executive orders. And I just want to say a little bit about them. Obviously, the rejoining the Paris Agreement is something the president had sole power to do. So in 30 days, it takes effect, but it's a very significant move on the international front. But it also has a lot of impact back here in the domestic front. I think one of the things that among the many distortions in the rhetoric of this past administration was a total misunderstanding about the Paris Agreement, because it doesn't legally obligate us to do much at all, except to submit a nationally determined commitment. What will we try to achieve? And there's no legal way of enforcing that. So it wasn't very strong in that regard. They acted as if it transformed the economy, which was pure baloney. But it's very important because right now, we're supposed to, by November, at the Glasgow Conference of Parties, that's the next big negotiating event, we're supposed to come forth with our new plan for the next 5 years of projected ahead as to what we will do and how we will achieve it. And so this is a lot of pressure on the administration to get its act together and get as much accomplished as possible. There were several other, I'm just going to mention one of the other. There was a very broad directive, the executive order, to all the agencies that are involved on these issues that might be related to the Congress, to the climate. And they were told to review every rule that has been put in place over the last 4 years. They were told to come up with, in 30 days, submit to the Office of Management Budget, that's the right arm of the White House, their plan for what they're planning to do to get started on new rules. And they particularly highlighted a few of the key ones they wanted to focus on, which was the power plant rule, the cars on the car efficiency rules, the appliance efficiency rules, the methane fugitive emission rules, kind of thing. And they also established a working group that is expected to act, that's across the government working group, to reestablish a strong and more accurate social cost of carbon. Now, for those of you that are involved in the regulatory processes, you will recognize this is one of the elements of the regulatory analysis that is always is utilized to determine the costs and the benefits of these rules, and it's part of the defense in the courts. So these are very significant moves. They're going to take a lot of time to engage in, and it's very important to recognize that while the president has the authority to make this directive, all these agencies have to follow the regulatory processes. The president hasn't been able to dictate the outcome. That has to go through a serious process kind of thing. But there's something I think we can read into this, read from it, and that is that clearly a major part of the strategy of the administration is going to be called what we call a regulatory strategy, to use regulation as a way to move mandates and whatnot to move the economy. It's not a pricing policy that a lot of economists would prefer. You may remember that that's what the Waxman-Markey bill was in 2009. That was a cap and trade, which sets a price in the marketplace for carbon dioxide. And by the way, that was President Obama's preference, was to go with the pricing thing. But when Congress flamed out, he resorted to utilization of the regulatory processes. And one of the obviously political advantages for going for this route for the administration is it doesn't require congressional approval. And so you're building on existing law, and you don't have to have a Congress that's ready to sit up and do what many of us think it should. But as I think many people know, every rule is subject to lawsuits. And the most common kind of lawsuit is to say, wait a minute, they have used more authority than Congress granted them. And this is going to be a serious question. It always is a serious question, but it's a more serious question because if we start to begin speculating, we have a more conservative Supreme Court that probably will take a more narrow view as to what discretion the agency has to do this, a more restrictive view. But now if we turn quickly to things that Congress requires, or where you require constitutional, you require congressional action, obviously any new authorities, any new taxes or new tax breaks, any new expenditures, and the administration would like to make some significant increases in public expenditures, those require acts by the Congress. And obviously the congressional power of the purse is one of the most critical one here. So the Biden administration will be seeking a lot of things out of the Congress. Now, we also need to remember that there are reasons sometimes it's very desirable to get congressional approval, even if you can do things under the regulatory system. One is the regulatory the authorities may not allow you to make your best choice of policy. So to design it better, you want new authority. Another is, of course, that it reduces the risk that you'll lose when you get to the court system on the rule that you think. And a third is, and you've heard voices, I'm sure, arguing this, it reduces the political risk that we might have a throwback of the regulations with a new administration, the kind of experience we had under Trump. Though I would argue we'll never go back that far, but we simply cannot know where we'll be. Let me just use one example of one area in which I'm going to do some speculation here on which Janet McCabe, either now or later, would be far more better to address this, but she's not going to. Nobody that's nominated is now going to express their opinions about these things. That's just the way Washington works, so she's being very wise. Let me suggest in the electric sector, one thing to understand about the strategy here of the Biden administration, and it's a strategy that a number of major reports have undertaken to recommend, is that going after the electric sector and really pushing it down on emissions faster than you do in the other critical sectors of the economy is a major strategic choice. The electric sector is in fact no longer the main, they don't do more emitting than other sectors like transportation. It has made some significant progress, but the theory for doing this is we want to use electricity to help decarbonize, for example, transportation, buildings, and some industrial processes. And that means we're going to be actually using more electricity over the next 30 years, despite efforts to conserve. So in other words, part of your strategy is clean up the electric system so you can help clean up other aspects of the economy that are in some ways more difficult to do. Well, one of the things that was talked about in the campaign, and one of the things that a number of academics and others have been recommending is, well, why don't you adopt something called a clean energy standard as your way to regulate this industry? And I'm not going to go into what's involved in it. Some of you may be doing research on it. But the question then is, do you need new legislation from Congress to really do this and to do it effectively? Or can you squeeze it into the Clean Air Act and use that as your basis for regulating? And at some point, the administration, it might come soon, will have to make a choice as to whether to pursue this on the regulatory front or whether they might even do both. Start on the regulatory front and then seek Congress to act. This is thought to be a more efficient way to do things, but all this remains to be seen, kind of thing. So stay tuned, especially those of you that follow the law. Now, I want to make some comments about Congress and about what we might expect from the Republicans as well, because they are changing and they've already done some positive things, I will say. But I'm going to save that and move forward a little bit and perhaps come back to your question. The final thing I would say about the politics of all this is just a final reminder, which I'm sure this sophisticated audience understands, but it's a really hard one for a lot of Americans to swallow. And that is, expect political bargaining to get anything done. Political bargaining is very much a part of the democratic way that we operate, especially in an economy that is so big, so complex, and people are affected so differently across America. And many Americans and some academics have great disdain for this process of bargaining. Now, let's be clear, not all compromises are acceptable, but rejecting all compromise is also not acceptable. That is a way to stalemate his way. So there are going to be lots of good people who are going to make some tough choices as to whether they're willing to support compromise when they know it's not doing all that they believe is important. Well, let me turn to this sort of last bucket very quickly and say that for me, one of the things over the years has been, oh my gosh, how do we think about both psychologically and intellectually? This is a long-term thing, decades ahead that we're working on. It filters through our entire society, and everything about it really speaks to dynamism with lots of uncertainty. So how do we get our heads around this and think about it? Well, I had the educational experience of being part of the National Academy of Sciences 5-volume report on making climate choices for America. That's not the actual accurate title, but about climate choices. And they emphasize that a framework for thinking about this that I think it's just useful to be aware of, and I find very helpful, because we are talking about proposals that are way out. We are talking about a situation where it's highly improbable that any of the things that we're doing now reach the goals that we think. We're talking about really not having once and for all, we've adopted a grand policy, and that with some adjustments over years will get us there. That's a desirable thing. Many advocates focus on that kind of way of thinking. Well, and so there are going to be, in many cases, a lot of disappointment and a lot of depression. But let me suggest to you that a more realistic way to think about our expectations for something I believe is absolutely compelling that we do all we can. And that is, is to understand, and I'll come to this process in a moment, the framework, to understand that there is no human exists in human experience. Nobody has shown us any example where we've been able to see clearly the future of 3 decades out. We've been able to actually adopt a policy or plan to get there. It's just beyond our experience. And as people over and over say, there are all kinds of uncertainties on that path, uncertainties in the way technology is develops and adopted, uncertainties in how the economy moves, uncertainties in politics, and invariably we'll make mistakes, we'll need to shift course. So this is the framework that America's Climate Choices, that's what the title was, suggests. It's called iterative risk management. Now that will inspire any class, just the title. And of course, but it's basically the idea that you simply, with the intellectual, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the intellectually sophisticated way and then turn to the common sense that helps me, is we do a serious analysis of the risk. And many of you are involved in the methodologies that help assess what are those outside the long-term risk on climate change. Then you adopt policies, obviously, to try to mitigate those risks. But the key here that I think is important is you recognize you need to periodically reassess, probably every 4 or 5 years. You need to reassess where we are in the science. Is it a bigger problem or less of a problem than we thought? Where are we in all these claims about technology? And boy, I'll tell you, the advocacy out there say, if you'll just adopt this technology, man, that's it. And everybody knows that's not the case. Where are we in the economy? And very importantly, and something some of you may participate in your research, is which of these policies are really effective? And is there a more cost-effective way we ought to do because then what we do is we correct course and we readjust. Either the urgency is greater or it might even be less. I think it's going to be greater, frankly. Now, the common sense version of this that people are familiar with in business and in life usually is we do what we can with what we know, and then we assume that we're going to learn more and prepare more, and we're going to do more later. So we don't have to swallow the whole enchilada at first and be right about it. In fact, it's almost certain we won't be right about it. Well, let me do this. Let me get you involved in this kind of thing and take some of your questions. I'm sorry we don't have a more open audience where you could really engage with your comments, because I'm certainly some of you would have some great things to add to this proposition. So Janet, take it away.
Thank you, Phil. That was great. And you really teed up a lot of things here. We've gotten a number of really interesting questions come in, so I don't think we're going to have any problem. The problem might be getting to everybody's questions, so we'll do our best here. So here's the first question that came in. What, from your perspective at this point, prospects for the implementation of an actual carbon tax during the next 4 years?
Well, first of all, that's one of my preferred policies. I was at Resources of the Future, and the economists there would string me up if I didn't make that clear. But at the moment, it doesn't have high prospects. Let me suggest to you how it might emerge. It's not going to emerge at first, but you may have noticed that we cannot fund everything we want to do in this country. And so we're going to be clearly dealing with the tax code, both in terms of monies that need to be raised and in terms of fairness. And in that process might be a great opportunity to adopt a carbon tax, probably not a high-end, strong tax that would be the thing to do if you really want to reduce on the regulatory side what you're doing. But I think it is a possibility, and I think it's very important to do. But that will emerge only after we have a couple of years of getting things started, kind of proposition. Let me suggest to you, this option was available to President Trump when he came to office. People, some of the senior Republicans, the grand old men, and they were men, of the Republican Party came to him like George Shultz, and they said, adopt a carbon tax that is revenue neutral. In other words, you don't just pile in a lot of money, you give it back in one way or another, kind of proposition. And they urged that as a conservative way to avoid, one, to deal with the issue, and two, to avoid that. Of course, that all got dismissed. By the way, it would have helped them in their tax bill actually pay for some of the tax cutting that they did. So it's out there. Nobody should give up on it. But I think to expect it early on is out of the question.
Great. Yeah, we had several questions that related to that topic. So thank you for that answer. Here's one that question a bunch of times. I'm interested in your response. The question is, my understanding is that nuclear power plants are currently a substantial source of non-carbon emissions in the US, but many power plants are scheduled to go out of commission in the next few decades. What are your thoughts on nuclear power as a sustainable energy source? And what is your perception of the politics surrounding nuclear power? Is it an important part of America's energy future?
Well, I'm going to spend a few more minutes on this. It's something I'm very much interested in. And I need to tell you that I'm no longer anymore on the board of directors of Duke Energy, where I was on their oversight committee of the 12 nuclear power plants that they had. So I've been deeply involved in this. And when I was in Congress, I had my subcommittee had regulatory authority over the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So you can take that as, I know what I'm talking about, or you can take that as, oh my God, he's sold out. However you want to approach that. But let me suggest to you a couple things. First of all, the existing power plants, I've forgotten the number, I think it's down to about 99 or something like that. Those are producing half of all our carbon-free emissions in the country. Water power, hydropower is the second big chunk, and you get way down much lower on the newer solar and wind. So it's really important. And what we're finding is certain of the power plants, they're usually single plants run by a company as opposed to dual plants and things, are just harder to make economically work in today's world with low price natural gas prices, which are cheaper, but and also we have a lot of subsidies that work on adopting wind power into the system. So the point is that I think we ought to be doing more to help not lose those plants unless there's a critical safety issue. That's a whole nother reason to close anything down. But what we already have in place is the state of New York, the state of Illinois, the state of New Jersey, each of them in their regulatory pricing of electricity in their areas have actually generated a special benefit for the low carbon nuclear power plants to try to prevent that from happening. And I think you'll see some more action out of the Congress do it. Then we need to turn to, and by the way, I was also on the President's Commission to try to figure out what to do about nuclear waste. We won't talk about that unless you want to at this moment, but let's talk about additional power. The Congress already on a bipartisan basis has adopted some authority to push the development of what we call advanced nuclear power systems. Now, these are expensive. They'll be out at our plant, our major laboratory in Idaho. They're going to be developed out there. They're going to take years to do. And I think we should do it only because we don't know how for sure we're going to get to a 2050 goal of carbon-free economy. So we need to keep these options alive. Now, there is one possibility, and that's the small nuclear reactor, which is actually getting licensed now, but whether that will get developed and economically in the marketplace remains to be seen. Let me also say that there is fusion development, and this was almost used to be laughable. Those of us that dealt with issues in the 1970s, this was always held out as a promise. But now, because of advanced materials and all kinds of other scientific improvements, we actually have private investors on 2 or 3 companies that are talking about trying to get a fusion power plants going. Again, this is long-term. These are 20, 30 years out. But again, it's trying to develop more options for us in the future. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, great answer. And for students who are on the phone, it's an illustration of areas in which there's a great future for people who learn about these issues to help develop some of these technologies and the policies that you need in order to implement them. So
Actually, I'll say that it may be happening at IU, but at schools like MIT, where they always have done a lot of nuclear work. The number of students getting into these programs has really increased in the last few years.
yeah, interesting. So here's a question on the other side of the carbon spectrum. What are the legislative prospects for land-based decarbonization actions such as reforestation and greener agriculture practices? This is an issue of great interest to the state of Indiana, of course.
Well, first of all, this is already one of the things about the Biden approach, but it's not just him, it's others, was what they call all government approach. And what they're going to do is in agricultural policy, in land management policies, you're going to see a number of green proposals. A number of these had been developed 5 or 10 years ago, actually. And in the House of Representatives, they've done a lot of hearings on these kind of questions in the last couple of years. And if you want to, you can look up the Select Committee on Climate Crisis that the House of Representatives had operating over the last 2 years. They put out a 500-page report with all kinds of proposals, a number of them dealing with exactly what you're talking about. Now, I don't tend to follow those as closely, but a lot of it's based on incentives to, enrich the soil, which, by the way, absorbs more carbon dioxide when it's a good, healthy soil, which is also good, healthy for product, and other farming practices. So they're going to be a part of it. And by the way, some of these policy systems can be developed that actually have what we call offsets, where an industry like a utility that can't quite make the grade this year on what it does could pay farmers to take some actions. Those are the way that these policies are getting integrated together.
Yeah, and I think
very important though. We have to be working on all levels of this. And by the way, some of you may want to change your diet. I'm not a big recommendation on that, although I've tried to eat less, but that's another thing.
Right, yeah, it comes from all directions. These questions that you guys are sending in are just awesome. Keep them coming, please. Here's a couple of pretty challenging ones, Phil. It's increasingly clear that unstable Earth systems present us with several large-scale discontinuities in the form of tipping points and rapid irreversible change. These challenge the use of assumptions regarding the possibility of risk assessment and risk management. And the person would love your comments on those statements.
Well, first of all, I have to be honest with you. I'm not intellectually skilled with all the methodologies that are involved in doing risk management that I indicated was recommended by this big study. But the one thing that I think that does tell us very strongly is we have to stay on top of this. We have to keep advancing the science to adjust it, and it builds the case for why this is compelling. I think these are called fat tail events, but the real, I mean, you're talking about the currents in the air, the currents in the ocean. You're talking about a number of the possible melting of the permafrost around the Arctic, and all these kind of things that will just shoot up much more emissions into the air, both methane and carbon dioxide. So we just have to stay at this, and we have to continue to invest in the science. The reason I say that is I've been at conferences where I've even heard some scientists say, okay, we know what's a problem. Stop investing in the science, put the money over in technology. I think we don't want to do that kind of proposition. But what you raise are very important questions. But there are, as it was written to me, there are uncertainties about whether these will result. But they sure tell us, get smart, get action.
Yeah. Well, this one is, I think, flows very nicely from that question, which is, do you have the sense that our energy future, say in 100 years, will hold overall less total available energy for our use? Will we need to adapt our lifestyles to a smaller scale, lower energy future? And I would append to that, and how do we talk about that publicly as a way to effectively inspire good policy development?
Well, first of all, behavior change is both necessary and I think inevitable. The issue is, though, it's a little hard to just preach, do the right thing. A lot of people go to my family, go to church on Sunday and pledge to do better. And on Wednesday, by Wednesday, we may not be as good a person as we thought we were going to be. That does not to say we don't need preaching for doing this. At the moment, I think the way we're going to proceed is primarily by trying to recognize technologies that can help us do things we think we want to do now more efficiently or more cleanly. That's something we know we can do. But you've touched on the right thing, which is policies that are worth their name always change somebody's behavior, whether it's changing an investor where they put their money, changing a consumer the way they eat or what they do. And I do think there's wide room in the public discussion, and should be, for how we need to begin to move different lifestyles. By the way, we all have gotten a massive test of that this year, of changing our lifestyles in ways that people thought wouldn't work. Now, a lot of it we don't like, but the fact is we can, and I think we will. We already see it in new generations. I come from a generation where it was manly and sophisticated to smoke when you were a teenager. Any teenager that smokes now is really out to lunch, I think, among their people. So things will change, but pressing that. Now, I think it's important to recognize there is a whole advocacy, and maybe the questioner is a part of it. There's a whole advocacy on this kind of thing about, no, we have to really give up economic progress. But what has happened over the last decade on the international scene with the IPCC and others is they really have come to the view, no, we have to think in terms of, we can't expect to sell prosperity short, especially to people that have very little of it around the world. We can't expect them to just give all that up, which, by the way, helps us in the developed West. But so we have to find ways to develop in a green and rapid fashion.
Yeah, for sure. Just moving right from that point, here's a question. How do the other major societal challenges, you've mentioned one, which is the pandemic, but others, including racial injustice, economic troubles, facing the new administration, impact the strategies in and for major climate legislation or other governmental policies, I would add?
Well, one of the more interesting things, at least about the rhetoric of the new administration, is they are speaking and recognizing this, and they had to in the campaign, and this is a welcome change in America. And I dare say, Janet, when you were at EPA, you had a section on environmental justice, and it was talked about, but it is now front and center. And by environmental justice, it has a lot of meanings, but we're really talking about trying to recognize that some people live in very polluted areas and have health risks. Some people are taking the brunt of the transition, like coal miners, and there are various things. There's going to be a lot more attention to and sensitivity for. Now, this is not going to be easy. In many cases, though, what you're going to do is, if you recognize this problem, well, let me give you one example where the conflict exists. You ask about the carbon tax, or if you act about cap and trade, or you've talked about trading within the clean energy standard. Some of the environmental justice community are very much opposed because their theory, which they haven't always been wrong about in the past, I think they're missing the fundamental point though, but their theory is that, well, what this does is it allows a power plant that's spewing up emissions in here in lower Mississippi or wherever it is, in our backyard, because they can buy their way out with offsets out of the requirements. So you don't stop that. Now, one of the changes, it's already in the rules, is changing what's called the NAAQS standard on ozone. This is going to have it depends on what the EPA chooses to do, big impact on those kind of situations. So that's, in a sense, what I would call a compensatory thing. It probably helps us get less carbon dioxide, but it's not the frontal way in which you're going after carbon dioxide. So you're going to see a lot of compensation, things like that. So it's a very important series of things. But also what you're going to see in Congress, and one of the reasons we have some hope of getting things out of Congress is because you've got to do infrastructure. Well, there are a lot of good green things that can be done in infrastructure. You're going to deal with the transportation system, and the former mayor here in Indiana is going to be transportation. They're going to be focused on that. So there are lots of ways that this issue is going to arise. In fact, what's going to shock a lot of people in the traditional energy industries is this issue is going to arise on everything. Doesn't mean it always wins in the Congress, but there's going to be no more silence. I can promise you that.
Well, you read my mind, Phil, because I had identified a question about Mayor Pete from South Bend being Secretary of Department of Transportation, and what might you see that department doing in the next administration that will touch on climate?
Well, Janet, it's not an area that I generally focus on. To the extent I have any expertise, it's really on energy policy, energy policy, energy policy, and what goes on in the energy sector. However, I think one of the things there, as well as in a number of areas, is that there may be a change in NEPA. NEPA is the environmental assessment that has to be made before big projects. And in that, there will be a requirement that you consult with and that you take into account what are the impacts on these, I don't know what language is getting used, marginal communities or the communities that struggle with these issues. That would be brand new. Doesn't guarantee the decisions all get made, but I just heard an interview with him last night, and he was already saying all these projects, the big projects that people want to do in transportation, we're going to be looking at. What are those? There's those propositions. So that's one way that you're going to see.
Yeah. So here's a question. What might our government learn from Indigenous voices and worldview? Is there any indication that this administration or Congress may be listening more closely to these voices?
Well, again, one of the important developments in our democracy is the fact that we now actually have those voices far more prominent in both the public discussion and even in Congress. And her name escapes me at the moment, who's just become the new Secretary of Interior.
Secretary Haaland.
Yes. And by the way, when I was doing an orientation program at Harvard for the new members 2 years ago, she gave one of the most powerful, moving speeches. But you're right, we've all, to the extent any of us paid any attention, and I can't say I paid a lot, but much of the culture in many of the tribes has to do with recognizing the importance of Mother Nature and actually recognizing the benefits that flow from that, not just spiritually, but also as a very practical matter. And that philosophy is becoming much more prominent, I think, in America. Some of us that are older can actually remember some advertising years ago where they had, you saw this look like an Indian warrior who has a tear running down his face as they show us the landscape being destroyed. And it was very moving at the time. That was back, I think, when the environmental movement was just getting started. Excuse me. You get one of us old guys involved and we just can't stop.
Okay. Well, here's a question that goes to your experience in Congress. What talking points or angles do you think will be most influential to get Republicans to act urgently in Congress on climate?
Well, here's what I think the issue is going to come up under other banners. Just like I said, it's going to come up on all kinds of issues so that it'll be talked about in how are we going to stay internationally competitive? I mentioned the fact that if you want to be in the modern marketplace, you better be on the cutting edge of this stuff instead of 10 years behind. So competition and innovation, and they're already talking in these terms considerably. So we had a major agreement last fall, shockingly so, in the big funding bill, which was bipartisan and put a lot more money into new technologies, and many of which are going to be very important on climate kind of propositions. So innovation and there. And if we get to a stimulus, some of them are going to probably support more economic stimulus, assuming the economy just doesn't take off, which I don't think anybody expects it to. And so there you may get a lot of investment again. So I think it's going to come up under other other ways. And by the way, there's going to be lots of bargaining. Just give you an example. So one of the things that's happening, well, it's going to come up under the word resilience. Resilience is a new, modern, bipartisan word. Everybody's for resilience of our infrastructure because the hurricanes and the floods and the fires are taking out and costing a lot of money to private sector, governments, federal government. And so we shell out a lot more money on this, just in disaster relief. So, okay, so if Georgia and Louisiana and other places want more money, I can bet you that there's going to be bargaining in the Congress in which they say, fine, we'll give you more disaster relief, but you've also got to take these actions or support these things. That's where it gets to the bargaining that I want to, I don't elevate it to high praise, but it's a critical part. So many people that are not on, in both parties are not on board as much, are going to find themselves having to make choices to support bargains.
Well, thank you to everybody for all the questions. Phil asked if he could have the last couple of minutes to sort of wrap things up and especially speak to our students that are listening today. I know there are students on the line. I recognize one of my students at least. Thank you for joining. So Phil, I'll turn it back to you to close us out, and then we'll just say goodbye on the end.
Well, thank you, Janet. First of all, I'm just honored and pleased that, to be invited, and so glad to see the energy and activity through the Indiana University system that's going on. I haven't kept up in recent years, but so delighted. But let me just say a couple obvious things. One is we are going to be grappling with this issue of how to cut carbon dioxide in our economy and how to adjust to the warming that's going to continue and increase throughout the lives of everybody online here, every student in America. But I think one of the things is we often cast that in very negative ways, and there clearly are negative hurdles and costs, but there are incredible opportunities being opened up for careers in all kinds of ways that either directly or indirectly are related to taking on these challenges, whether it's in science, in teaching, in being an innovator, being an entrepreneur, in investment opportunities, to where to put your 401k, for example. There are enormous positive things that are going to go on. And so if you want to get with the future, this is part of the way to do that. But let me also say something about which really applies to all of us, not just to students. But when I was a graduate student, or at least at the tail end of my dissertation, America did one of its great technological and organizational achievements by going to the moon. The moonshot, and oftentimes you hear people saying, that's what we need now is a moonshot. Well, one of the very significant things about the moonshot was most of us could only be kibitzers. We could only watch. We couldn't participate in it. Maybe they took a little of our taxes, but there were thousands of Americans that were technically competent and very well organized, but most of us, we just could observe. That's not the case here. All of us help contribute to the problem. Some people a lot more than others, but all of us contribute, and all of us can take either small or larger actions to help. And adding up small options by millions of citizens do make a difference. Just let me quickly remind us, which somebody already, a couple of questions already remind us, we're all consumers. What we eat, what we drive, how we transport ourselves, all of these kind of questions, we can reduce our carbon footprint that way. We're all citizens who, I assume all your people on here have the right to vote. So you can exercise it at the ballot box, or you can exercise your First Amendment right to petition the government. People forget about that, right? And petition the government means hound Janet McCabe to move as aggressively on this as you can. Hound your congressman. Hound may not be the act. Well, it is. It's the right thing to do. Don't be shy. Ask them what they're doing, kind of thing. But also, we can all either individually or collectively join in efforts to cut carbon footprints, whether it's at Indiana University, which is happening at universities all across the country, whether it's in your place of work, to raise the question, to join employees and asking the management, what are you doing? Or are there things that we can do to do this? at your church or synagogue, the same thing. You can incorporate it in your teaching kind of thing. So there are many, many ways that you can help change the picture and the trajectory we're on and make a difference. And basically, this is no time for hand-wringing and depression. This is a time to roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Well, hear, hear, and thank you again, Phil, for joining us today. Thanks to everybody for joining to listen. We have been recording this session, so especially if you're a teacher at IU and you want to have your students listen to this conversation, you'll be able to do that. Thank you again. Please join us for our upcoming events, which you'll find on the IPE and ERI websites, and we'll love to have you in the future. Thanks again, Phil. Everybody have a great and safe weekend. Be well, wear a mask, and take care of yourselves.
Thanks.